All right, rock and roll. Andrew, back once again. Thank God, because I get bored of doing these on my own. But before we actually get into it, that is The Dialectic of Sex. What's the subtitle called?
The Case for Feminist Revolution.
The Case for Feminist Revolution. Andrew, what do you do? Andrew, what do you do?
What do I do?
What do you do?
I'm a PhD candidate at the Center for Theory and Criticism, which means that I spend an unhealthy portion of my life sitting down reading books and or theorizing and criticizing about them. My interests sort of vary from conspiracy theories, as we were talking about earlier, right-wing movements, post-Marxists, ideologies and sort of revolutionary groups, and intellectual history. So that's largely my background as I conceive of it spontaneously right now. But also what I like to do is buy a whole bunch of books that I rarely get around to reading more than once, and so I get you to read the books that I want to read twice, and then I come.
So you have a reason. I'll hold you to
do
it.
a study to discuss them with you.
Yeah. I guess that's a good reason, and you give me reasons to read things that maybe otherwise I wouldn't have. Not only not read, but probably wouldn't have even heard of.
Yeah.
This being one example, but more than that, you do writings. You write for magazines.
Yes.
So you should mention that a bit.
Well,
I'll put your links up in here.
No, I'd appreciate that a good deal. I mean, as I said, I do write about mainly on conspiracy theories and the radical right. So two of my recent pieces, one came out on Commune. It's called The American Roots of a Right-Wing Conspiracy Theory. It's about Lyndon LaRouche and the cultural Marxism myth. And the one after that is about a book called Revolution from Above by New Zealand conspiracy theorist Kerry Bolton, who talks about how evil European philosophers brought critical theory to America through the New School. And that's out on Public Seminar, which is like the online magazine for the New School. So, as you can tell, I'm very much a member of the New World Order, and I'm here to make sure that it stays.
Oh yeah, me too. I get my Illuminati hood next week.
Okay, well that's wonderful.
They aren't going to dry clean it for me though.
Well, it's tumble dry only, so
my dryer does that. Thank God.
Yeah, goodness.
So, as for today, we have The Dialectic of Sex. So this is, how do you pronounce the name? Shulamith?
Shulamith FIrestone. Admittedly, you should learn how to pronounce the name of the person you're discussing on the podcast. Yeah. But I usually say Shulamith FIrestone, or just refer to her as FIrestone.
Yeah, FIrestone is a lot better.
It's a very cool surname.
I would sell my soul for that surname.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's very rock and roll.
Yeah, certainly.
So she wrote this. This is from 1970. She was 25 when she wrote it. 24, 25, I think.
Indeed. A member of the, sort of various radical feminist groups in New York at the time. So
feminism?
It's a response to... the book emerges from her experience in the women's liberation movement at the time, and can sort of be described as a critique of certain elements within the women's right movement and the proposal for a kind of feminist socialism, a feminist socialist future. So it's sort of one of the key texts of what gets described as sort of radical feminism. You get other people like Mary Daly and Germaine Greer, who were part of this sort of same era and had a similar ethos to FIrestone. But FIrestone is
excuse the train.
Yeah, indeed, the train is the one out of all of them that has whose book has sort of been returned to in theory and philosophical circles, especially among like the xenofeminists like Helen Hester and also Sophie Lewis, whose book Full Surrogacy now is like almost like an updated version of the dialectic of some of the arguments put forward in the dialectic of sex.
So when she framed, just from the title alone, when we're dealing with a thing called the dialectic, one might think that obviously she's going to have some kind of Marxist leanings.
Mm-hmm.
But what is it for you? I have my own answer to this, but how does she distance herself from that movement proper, from Marxism, as it has been traditionally understood? So she makes reference to Marx, of course, and Engels a little bit more specifically, who gives her some more motivation to think of something different. What does that look like for you?
Well, one of main arguments in the book is that sexual difference has hitherto not been analysed as a class difference. So she has this category of the sex class and how woman's bondage essentially to biological reproduction has led to their confinement within the class category of womanhood and motherhood, and all that entails with like the family obligations and responsibilities. And from this sort of very basic division between like of reproductive processes between the male and the female, this has been crystallized into cultural forms that have that has split society into different classes and supported different social structures. So later in the book, she discusses like the division of male and female into the technological mode and the aesthetic mode, and how culture and society at large has been driven towards this process of trying to realize the conceivable in the actual. And because of the dialectic of sex splitting the male and female into like separate categories, it means that there isn't a overarching sublation of the dialectic in which the categories of male and female, of technological and aesthetic, are annihilated and overcome towards like for FIrestone, feminist socialism, or just like in a more simple term, the answer to the question, what comes next? So she thinks as long as this sort of dialectic of sex continues between like the male and the female, there won't be this socialist utopia. I don't mean that in a dismissive sense. I mean, I think she perceives an absence of like gender analysis in the Marxist socialist project that is kind of beneficial to consider. Let me just go off on a small digression about how in like some Marxist theoretical circles talk about how what we need to do is return to a proper economic class analysis rather than wasting our time with identity politics. What Firestone lays out in this book is that identity is a class concept, which means that this sort of dichotomy that gets set up by some relatively vulgar Marxist theoreticians remains trapped within the dialectic of sex without a resolution.
Yeah, and she goes so far as to even say that class distinction has its genesis within the division of sexuality, like not just looking toward the future but looking toward the past as well, seeing these things actually having been erected because of the subjugation of women in relation to men and by men, and what should be done about that. And so more than just the Marxist, she takes or suggests that people like Beauvoir also participate in this kind of othering of women, suggesting that she maintains the idea of a kind of Hegelian other that participates in this maintaining this kind of dialectical framework. And we could think of this going on, many years after, with people like Judith Butler, thinking about things in terms of, I guess, this kind of dialectical framework, or maintaining the necessity of there being an other, or there having to be an other, in order to constitute, a self, or to, oneself, which for her, and that's why I think that for my own part, this was really, what she was doing was really revolutionary, because it was really trying to think of the ways in which all those people claiming to be these so-called revolutionary thinkers were in many ways, replicating the exact same things that they were purporting to, to challenge.
Well, not only the revolutionary thinkers, but the revolutionaries themselves.
Yeah.
Which it gets into with the critique of certain strains of the women's rights movement and the women liberation movement, and also the radical left movements of her time. How the sex class issue was seen as auxiliary to revolutionary struggle rather than a fundamental part of it.
Yeah, exactly. And it makes so much sense. And maybe that's just because, now being somewhat versed in these issues, women make up more than half of the population, yet, when you consider how much power, wealth, authority they have, it's like nothing. There's nothing. So, relatively, that is. So it begs some pretty fundamental questions about, what is going on here? It seems as though one side of this equation is getting the short end of the stick, and that could hardly be reduced to, natural things, right? Which is also, I think, one of the things that makes her critique so interesting, especially when taking on the kind of biological assumptions about men and women. And we see this kind of thing as well in Simone de Beauvoir, when, she, I don't know if you know, but she has this long kind of scientific critique of that argument that, men are just superior to women because of brain sizes. And then she goes on to totally debunk that. Because if we follow that logic, one that still floats around various, online circles, does that mean that shorter people are, less intelligent than taller people? There's no logic to that, or it doesn't follow through very well. But she gives us a very interesting template to really get at the foundations of all of these assumptions that people were taking for granted at the time, and even today, I think.
Most certainly. And, I mean, I hesitate to talk about how she... the category of the natural is a very complicated thing to unpack, but she does see her moment in time as this point at which women can be liberated from their biology, and the resistance to that. I mean, she talks about it in relation to childhood, but it can be about the relationship between childhood and the subjugation of woman, where she talks about how a physical difference has been enlarged culturally with the help of special dress, education, manners, and activity, until this cultural reinforcement itself began to appear natural, even instinctive, an exaggeration process that enables easy stereotyping. So there's this argument in the book about how the natural is fabricated and reinforced and perpetuated, largely to support the class structure that you were describing, about how there is one half of the population with a disproportionate amount of power and influence, particularly over the other half of the population that tends to lack it, and the justifications for them are based on this aspect, on this sense of the natural that is really quite contingent, but also very contagious at the same time.
So, but reading this, I feel like someone could also fall into a certain trap reading it, because when she's saying, and she's lays this out right from the beginning, that she feels one of the impediments to women's progress is their biological makeup, like their ability to give birth and all this. Whereas she's saying, you know what, even the way that we have a relationship to this thing is, which we then come to call natural, like as though childbirth and then child rearing are natural things, are not themselves natural. So she is very careful not to conflate the two, to suggest like there is a universal or attaching to the biological possibilities of women, in quotes, attaching to that a kind of universal or natural quality, but rather suggesting that the way in which it is viewed by society at large, especially in those patriarchal capitalist ones, that see that body as being something that is manipulable, something that can be used for the system, and that therefore the best way to mobilize that is to sell it as being natural, saying, look, women can do this, therefore they should do this. Women can, serve X, Y, and Z functions, and therefore it's a universal thing. Whereas she's really, at least the impression I get, is her just trying to totally overhaul from the foundations, just fundamental assumptions about naturality, which, the postmodern neo-Marxist, bulbs or sirens are now ringing like, who is this crazy person? Back in 1970, before the Gulag Archipelago was released. Who is this person? But yeah, just, this is certainly one of the things I saw really interesting about this text, because it's not really an argument I'd seen before, especially how it relates to the technological side of things, or her argument that technology can emancipate women from their own biologies, because those biologies weren't always there. Those biologies were imposed upon them by various mechanisms of, I will say, power, but you could be more specific with class or with anything else that makes these things natural, and that therefore through their becoming natural, makes it mandatory.
Well, I mean, it's similar to like human beings are not natural creatures at all. I mean, you can measure this with like the concept of life expectancy. Like there have been ways that sort of culture has been able to respond to natural phenomenon in ways to thwart it or divert it or prevent it, that have enabled us to build societies and the cultures in the same way that we have. And she talks about how the family was a a cultural form that emerged from an era in which women were more like subservient to to a prescribed idea of like their biological or reproductive function, and also how childhood got wrapped up into that, and there was a sense of a physical dependency of both the woman and the child on the male. And one of her arguments about the sort of the ways that technology can emancipate women from their previous position of subjugation is that it is this cultural or technological response to the trials of like a biological existence. So there is this sense in which like the cultural forms that were produced in response to like a particular particular mode of reproduction, as in like the family, the patriarch was a person who would earn the money or go out and like provide sustenance for everyone else. The woman stayed at home to reproduce and also like provide nourishment for the child and for the father, and the way that the child was perceived as the property of the patriarch is no longer a adequate or appropriate form for relating to one another in the face of these new technological advancements like the pill and automation and other forms of like reproductive control. Means that we have a more like a conscious grasp over seemingly natural or biological processes. This comes much later in like a chapter on feminism and ecology. And she's writing in like the early 1970s, where ideas like the population bomb were very popular, about how overpopulation would create a how humans would become so. Let me think about how to phrase this. How the planet would become so overpopulated that we wouldn't be able to find the adequate resources to support the number of humans living on the planet, and so Firestone perceives this as like us failing a inverted commas like natural balance, but the task now is for us to find a conscious artificial balance that is able to overcome the sex class system.
Yeah, and I remember from when reading it that she gave specifically, writing this in 1969, 1970, she said that she was quoting scientists that were saying that in 40 years, like, you know, the United States is going to reach its threshold. It's like, oh shit. I wonder what you know. We're already past.
Maybe it has. I don't know.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Maybe we're already beyond it. But so she was positioning herself in contradistinction to a number of other groups. So really broadly, you know, there were the conservative feminists. Mm-hmm. There were the reformist feminists. So you had the conservative feminists that obviously she had no affinity with. Then there were the liberal feminists who were on the more reformist side, right? Who would, you know, I guess, champion women's rights, but would also always do so through like the man's voice, or through the patriarchal institutions and structures that were already, you know, built for their favor. So she would ask, you know, how much change can you actually enact through these institutions? But then she's, you know, positioning herself in this really radical position, which is also a little bit ironic, because she's, you know, saying that we need the developments of this system to get us out of this system. Like, she draws the line at, you know, engaging in, I guess, the political measures or the political means that the liberal feminists or reformist feminists were, but she's really wants to mobilize the kind of scientific developments that were very patriarchal, even at the time, obviously. Kind of seeing them as a way out, which I thought was interesting, that she created that bifurcation, or saw a distinction between these two types of, emancipatory strategies. That she didn't at any point bring that up or question, like, how does this technology maybe not get us to where we need to go? Or I didn't find it was really sifted out as much as it could have been. So I was curious what you thought about that. If maybe she should have paid more credence to that, like how those technologies were, part of this system, how they replicated that problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do agree. I have a sense that stuff like the pill was seen with much more like revolutionary potential than we conceive of it now. But I think that's always been like the strange irony in any kind of Marxist analysis. Like, you think about the Communist Manifesto, where Marx and Engels are like praising the developments of industrialism and bourgeois society. So there is always like this aspect of like Marxist revolutionary rhetoric that is trying to use the tools of the current society to produce a future one. And there is one argument to be made that you could make through like an Arendtian lens or an Illich lens, just to use like the two people we've discussed before, of how...
Go check out those videos.
Exactly. How at least technologies always wedded to the system from which they are created or like used. But for Firestone, she says, I think later on in the book, that we shouldn't judge technologies by the way that they're used under the current system. We should try to imagine how they could be used under like under alternative like society arrangements of society, I guess.
Yeah, and that does really harken back to Marx, obviously, because Marx is saying that one of the prerequisites for the kind of socialist revolution or arriving at socialism or communism is having an educated population. Mm-hmm. So, but how do they get educated? Obviously, they have to use the means that were available to them. That is, using the system against the system, or using what the system offers them against the very system, which is, I guess, we're forced to do that. Those marginalized communities can't just float outside of the system in which they're living and then exact some kind of change over it from some kind of like transcendent principle, because that's also pretty problematic to assume that. And if that was to try to be enacted, like, imagine the chaos. The world would crumble.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I mean, it would be pretty dramatic. What did you think about her concept of the 50-year ridicule of the perceived gap between like the fight for suffrage and the later women's liberation movement?
Right, because she was saying that, if I remember correctly, that the suffrage movement, although good for her, was like, a kind of pressure valve. It's like, fine, we'll give women this,
Indeed.
And then they'll be fine. But then what followed, right, was not just like ridicule, and I think that she really hits the nail on the head. Like, people were, especially coming up against Thatcher and Reaganism, having people go to these kind of ultra individualistic or neoliberal type doctrines. It really made a mockery of the whole feminist movement, because suddenly, after this movement had occurred, there were all these women that were just living in the home, essentially, kind of, I guess, making people think And of course, it isn't their fault, but people thinking to that, well, what a revolution that was, you know? You did a great job, and now you're here doing this. What you should be doing, like, good, really good. But aside from that, I didn't give that part a whole lot of thought.
Well, I think it's... I mean, for me, what's striking about it is how there are moments of, like, almost... there are moments of, like, political tension and conflict that threaten to almost obliterate the way that society and culture is structured, and there are then reactionary... I always use the word movement in that sense. Reactionary, like, impulses that are asserted against it. So, like, in the 50-year article, Firestone talks about, like, the 20s, of, like, the flapper era and eroticism and style being used as tools of, like, perceived liberation that are diverting the energies of a woman who would otherwise be part of, like, a more, like, political liberation movement towards, like, mere, like, self-directed ends, and how that sort of a cultural tool of repression was revised or redirected in later eras. And I wonder whether something very similar happened to, like, the moment of radical feminism in the late 60s and early 70s, how there are arguments made about how, like, the counterculture of the 60s and the 70s became commodified and commercialized and tamed, and whether that's something that obviously Firestone couldn't anticipate in her own tract, or whether there's something about, like, Firestone's radicality that sort of resists being co-opted or, like, undermined by, like, these cultural tools that power uses to, like, immunize itself against revolutionary currents.
Right, and she seemed tuned into that too, because when she's listing off all the, you know, women feminists that are remembered, right?
Yeah.
You know, she's
the goody goodies.
Exactly. The ones that aren't too far, you know, aren't too radical. It's like you know, you're okay. You're okay. Like, we see where you're coming from. That's fine. So I think she was tuned into that, like, that idea that, you know, you really, and I think she embodied it, like, taking on a position that was so far outside of the dominant narrative that she was, you know, co-optable. And I don't know if it's true. The system probably found ways. Like, capitalism is particularly effective at taking whatever is antithetical to it and incorporating it, inoculating itself to some extent.
Well, I mean, one of the arguments by I told you about the news report about, like, feminist movements in New York that I watched earlier that had, like, a straw interview of Firestone. But one of the arguments made about the family is that under capitalism, the family is crumbling anyway. And so the radical abolition of the family is actually, like, a positive vision for the collapsing of the old society, I guess. It's kind of a sort of a fascinating aspect. So do you want to get to the Freudian question?
I would love to get to the Freudian question.
Yeah.
So this would be popping us into chapter 3 now.
Indeed. Yeah.
So Okay, so she has a kind of a tumultuous relationship with Freud and Freudianism, psychoanalysis, suggesting that Freudianism and feminism have their I guess their roots in the same soil. Mm-hmm. That is, they both recognize fundamental problems presented by various patriarchal institutions like the family, like, civilization and its discontents or anything else, or the problems posed by contemporary forms of sexuality or incest or how sexuality should be conducted. But FIrestone is pretty critical of the way that Freud approached these problems, suggesting that they were, or he didn't look at the way that they were part of a greater social phenomenon, and it seemed to her, at least how I understood it, but correct me if you have another interpretation, she saw in Freud a kind of limited analysis of something, tracing it to almost like a biological truism, as opposed to looking at it as being products of a social phenomena that have resulted in this framework. That is, the framework of the family, the framework of the Oedipus complex, yada, yada, yada. And that these things do not exist outside of these contexts. So one of the examples she gives, and well, it's not really an example, but one of the ways that she kind of undoes the Freudian argument is by saying that the Oedipus complex can't really be found in other settings, in other, I guess, epistemic frameworks where people don't live in nuclear family settings in the way that they do in the quote-unquote West, the global North, or whatever term to specify that. And yeah, before I go on, Andrew.
Well, yeah, as she says in the book, Freud was merely a diagnostician for what feminism purports to cure.
Yeah, there you go. That's a good, yeah, exactly.
And she senses the reactionary elements or uses of Freudian clinical psychology, of like merely operating to get people adjusted to their forms of oppression, either that either that's sort of lingering from their childhood, or that's existing in this sort of daily discontent within their marriages, and how especially clinical psychology developed in America as another one of those pressure valves, so that to allow people to let off steam, or like find quote unquote fulfillment.
But even in that way, like as FIrestone says, it wasn't successful. Like I don't have the stats in front of me, but she was, for only like 40% of participants or something, 40, 45 or something, would psychoanalysis prove to be like an effective strategy. Mm-hmm. And with such a small percentage, you'd ask like how much of that is the placebo effect, like someone telling you this is going to work, and then you making it work because of that. But yeah, sorry.
Yeah. No, I mean, there are many jokes about how Freudianism operated in America. Like, I can't think of any jokes that weren't by Woody Allen. But like, there's a Woody Allen joke about going to see a psychoanalyst and like how the psychoanalyst was a strict Freudian, and they make you pay for the sessions you miss. Yeah. So it is like a bit of a commercial racket, but it is seen as a cure that works if you even don't go to it. But it's no. I mean, that's a whole other issue in itself. But the many parts of the book, I guess, are discussing inadequate cures for the problems that inevitably arise from the sex class system.
Right.
So Freudianism is one. Romanticism is another. eroticism could also like sort of be subsumed under that label, but they are attempts to, quell the discontents that are produced by a particular way of like arranging relationships. I think maybe.
Yeah, well, and that's one of the things she says that Freudianism technically has in line with feminism, because they are identifying the same problem areas, right? As I said before.
Aye.
So, FIrestone says provocatively, and she's funny too. She's like, okay, well, as Freud tells us, the family is like the source of this kind of repression, as just one place. Like, she's like, let's do away with it. Yeah. To which all the other people are like, no, that's too far. That's too far. But, she makes the case that while feminism and Freudianism are, in many respects, identifying the same problems, for some reason, Freudianism is kind of an accepted phenomenon. It's taken up by the social paradigm as being kind of an accepted way to go about dealing with the world, whereas feminism was being looked at as some kind of like, crazy shit. Like, you're a feminist?
Well, that's because Freudianism didn't want to change
that's exactly
the system, because it's like, well, I mean, where are all my patients going to come from if we change the whole root of the problem?
Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, that's it. We did away with Freud.
Aye, yeah, indeed.
But I don't. Yeah.
But I mean, what? I mean, we'll touch on it later. But like, for the Oedipus complex then becomes a kind of heuristic for FIrestone throughout the following two chapters.
Right.
And you do wonder that if you kind of reject Freudianism, Freudian analysis of the problem, which provides the theory that motivates the idea of the cure, if you use Freudian analysis to investigate or problematize or try and critique the institutions of childhood and like institutionalized racism, then does the cure or the solution to those problems remain limited to that Freudian analysis, or is it possible to propose a different cure without departing from the Freudian analysis of those problems?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a massive question, and it would probably take a good
250 pages.
Well, it would take a good time to try and figure out whether FIrestone does that with like virtuosic success or not. I mean, it's essentially what she sets out to do, but and she does it. I mean, she obviously lays out interesting like a proposal for an alternative society in the end of the book, but you wonder whether her analysis of childhood and especially race is, through a Freudian lens, is sufficient.
Yeah, but it seems like while I might, and we'll get into this, but while I might not totally agree, I think that she's being fairly consistent, where she says that psychoanalysis is a thing that has taken over. Psychoanalysis has had an indelible effect, or has left an indelible mark on society at large. Mm-hmm. Therefore, it makes sense that, we adopt the same kind of rhetoric to oppose it, just like she says that we can take science. Take science to oppose the very system that births science. So why, like, you're right. Like, how could we, to untangle some of the complexities of that, I guess, theoretical strategy would be difficult. Mm-hmm. Before actually doing that, we'll save that for another day. What the hell is childhood? Why does childhood matter to her?
Because I mean, on one level, it is like a core component of like the Oedipus complex and power relations in itself. But it's under the sex class system. There's a special relationship between the mother and the child against the patriarch. So they, both the child and the woman or the wife or the mother, whatever role is prescribed to a particular subject, they have a kind of special relationship early on, because both of them are not permitted to participate in the masculine adult world. And in like the chapter of Down with Childhood, she explores how the whole concept of childhood it is pretty artificial and didn't really exist until the 17th century in the modern sense. Because in the medieval era, children were perceived as like just small adults, and this led to like sort of institutions like apprenticeships, which admittedly were only available to men for trades. So it sort of retains the element of patriarchy, but there is not an idea of childhood in the sense of the patriarchal nuclear family that we have in sort of modern society. So she sees this idea of childhood as this compulsory period in a person's life that leads them into assimilation into the sex class system, either as a man who then becomes, who as a child becomes more distant from his mother to participate in like the joys of patriarchy with his father, or as a girl who recognizes her mother's position of oppression within the system, tries to side with the father, and then gets excluded from the system as they grow older. And there are 2 or 3 things that I'd like to add to this. Her whole critique of childhood is wrapped up with a Marxist class analysis of how childhood was a bourgeois concept, because bourgeois children were the only people in the society or who were able to to be given the experience of childhood, whereas children from working class families at the time where this concept was being developed would have had to work, would have had to be treated no different from their parents, or wouldn't have had the same relationship to their parents as the bourgeois child would have had. So as this became like more diffuse with like a certain spread of affluence throughout society, this just sort of became accepted as a sort of hegemonic norm, which has led to like it's odd how it sort of overlaps with how FIrestone overlaps with Illich, but there is this critique of schooling, of instilling the virtue of discipline, which for FIrestone and also for Illich to a certain extent teaches repression as a spiritual value. So learning becomes more other-driven or approval-conscious, and eliminates or weakens the capacity for originality or creativity or intelligence or ingenuity, because it all becomes about integration and assimilation and oppression. And there is this parallel with the way that Firestone describes the more reformist elements of the feminist movement, of how they are trying to integrate themselves within a male constructed system, rather than seeking to completely overturn or abolish that system itself.
Yeah. Now I would add to that discussion of schooling that it slows development for
Yes, most certainly. Yeah.
Firestone, and this is something, and I was happy to read this because this is something I've thought of myself, where it's a ridiculous concept, right? And it certainly comes out in our when we talk about Illich, but like, let's put a group of people that don't know the world in a room together and assume they're going to understand the world when they come out of it. And they're going to stay together and grow, not being, having a ratio now in Ontario, 1 to 40 it can be with the new government. Like, you can have 40 students in a class or something. Like, 40 people that don't know the world, and have them sit together and assume they're going to learn about the world. Like, it's absurd. It's absurd.
Well, one of the perceptive remarks in Firestone's discussion of schooling and how is how the class itself, or this division of classes by age, means that younger children are detached from older children, and so there isn't that kind of peer-to-peer shared knowledge.
Yeah.
But because there is this kind of stratification of learning through age.
Yeah.
And that's one of the, like, I mean, this is one of the, let me try and figure out one of the fulfilling things about adulthood is that there is less of a sense of that stratification between ages, because I regularly talk to people who are 35 and 52.
Yeah,
and
we're in grad
30.
school, like, of course.
Yeah, this is much more aligned to how learning should probably take place.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't matter how old you are.
Yeah.
What is required is capacity for sharing and opening up to others, I think.
And she also has this other interesting insight that she hypothesizes that the creation of childhood, one of the other reasons that it could have been, was a way by which adults could romanticize the supposed time that they weren't, like, exploited. To which she says that makes no sense, because children are, like, being under constant surveillance. They're groomed in ways that, as you just said, as like adults aren't. They aren't this kind of peaceful, free being that we let out in the yard and play. Like, and that's especially
free range children. That's
exactly. But even at that time, I think it would have been better than now, where children are just like, instead of anyone watching them. Not to say anyone necessarily has to, but, like, let's just put them in front of a television, and then they can become part of big data or something, and then be used for various marketing campaigns. And that's a whole other thing. But what about sexuality? This is what's going to get my channel banned.
Oh, what?
Childhood sexuality.
Do you want to the Firestone pedophilia question?
Yeah.
This is...
It can't be ignored. We're going to have a Milo Yiannopoulos moment here.
Yeah, exactly. I spent... Well, this sounds, like, peculiar, but I spent a lot of time thinking about this question. And one of her comments about how sexuality is repressed and constrained under the sex class system is that it becomes wholly centered on genital sex rather than the need or desire for intimacy being expressed in a more polymorphous way that it isn't simply linked to the sex act. So when she sort of discusses later in the book about like child sexuality, I think she's referring to it in more of a polymorphous sense that doesn't make sense under our current arrangement of like sexual relations or intimate relations or the sex class system, because it simply wouldn't make sense at all. And also you wonder how much this enforced regime of like childhood fucks with like levels of maturity and immaturity and responsibility and consciousness of what relationships with other people mean. Like we were talking earlier about like how sex education in some cases is consciously like kept back from children or people who go to school because of various agendas. And so it is possible to like conceive of like inverted quotes child sexuality. Both those words should be inverted quote of like child, what we would consider now to be a child, but in an alternative arrangement would that distinction wouldn't hold as much, and sexuality in inverted commas of what sexuality might be in a more polymorphous sense might not be in the same way it is now. But on the topic of child sexuality and like the assumed paedophilia within Firestone's argument, it's only perceived as paedophilia within like the sex class system and the way that the sexuality is arranged along with that. But it is like a very awkward and almost inappropriate thing to discuss before that transition, because like how would that even work? And maybe beyond a transition it wouldn't at all be appropriate, or it would just be so unimaginable that we just couldn't figure out how it would work. It is I don't know, I mean, because she's trying to undo so many things in this book, like once those things are undone, then everything that is arranged in our thinking up to now just doesn't hold anymore.
Yeah.
But it is tricky. Like, how do you imagine a society that's completely alien into ours, while still living in the current society? Especially she talks about like how the abolition of the family would like mean that we wouldn't have the incest taboo anymore.
Right.
And like the reason that, I mean, it's unimaginable because it is still a taboo.
Yeah.
And you just sort of can't think of beyond the taboo, because the taboo is the unthinkable.
Yeah. This is what's given us a possibility to even think about it. Like it frames the way we understand it. But I like the distinction that you made, or suggesting that her discussion about child sexuality, doesn't necessarily have to do with genitalia in any way, but it could very well just be intimacy. Where I think that that holds a lot of weight, because instead of doing that, we tell kids, go play sports or go do this.
Don't touch yourself. Like don't. I mean that's a part of the Oedipus complex. It's just like, no, you're not allowed. It's in the enforcement of prohibitions upon the child that then become neuroses or later in life.
Yeah, and we actively like make them sublimate these kinds of feelings they might have, and ironically, we put children to play sports where they can only play with people of their gender.
No.
Yet we frown upon homosexuality or completely erase that from the curriculum, as though it's really quite absurd. But I think that all of these other institutions are like, they are sublimations, and they are ways that we, and I'm just trying to understand Firestone, I think that she's tapping into a kind of natural thing with children, and like anyone, like Freud, you start being sexual at the age of 0. As soon as you're born, you are a sexual being. And that in order to kind of curb these things, then we put them into other ways. We foster competition, we foster other kinds of non-intimacy because intimacy poses, I think, a great threat, at least I think Firestone would think, to the status quo. Because intimacy, imagine children or anyone else just touching each other. Like just
well, and there are various games, childhood games that do that. Like you think of Bulldog, you think of
right, but these are acceptable. Those are acceptable ways of doing it. Because if it extends beyond that, extends beyond a game where there's some kind of competition in play, where there can be a winner and a loser, then then it's not okay. If you're doing these types of things outside of that setting, then there's something wrong with you, which is quite absurd. And I think it really affirms what Firestone is saying about, the existence of this phenomenon that is sexuality, not just with children, but with anyone else. Yeah, you have any more on the children bit?
The costume element was fascinating.
Oh, with
the
boys?
history of costume and of how until the age of maturity, boys would be forced to dress more like girls until they were allowed to dress like a man.
Military garb or something.
Exactly.
The term, yeah.
And how costume really plays into like gender presentation, and I was chatting to someone about like the pockets phenomenon as well.
Like women's clothes don't have pockets?
Yeah, or inadequate pockets.
Yeah. Or fake pockets. Like they have the seams as though there's a pocket there, yeah.
But it's true just how like hard, like wired this sort of sexual division is kind of baked into like the way we think, or the way that we like even make clothes. The way that's signified can come down to something so simple as like what you're wearing. Yeah.
No, it's true.
So the racism, the sexism of the family of the man section. We will. That's where we're going to next. But we're going to pause this now. Okay.
Now for a word from our sponsors, which is no one, because no one sponsors this shit. Tune in for part 2. It's coming right at you.
How long have we been chatting? Okay, like an hour.